A wide range of pedestrians might be affected by TTC zones, including the young, elderly, and people with disabilities, such as hearing, visual, or mobility. These pedestrians need a clearly delineated and usable travel path. The various TTC provisions for pedestrian and worker safety set forth in this course shall be applied by knowledgeable persons after appropriate evaluation and engineering judgment. Advance notification of sidewalk closures shall be provided by the maintaining agency. If the TTC zone affects the movement of pedestrians, adequate pedestrian access and walkways shall be provided. If the TTC zone affects an accessible and detectable pedestrian facility, the accessibility and detectability shall be maintained along the alternate pedestrian route. If establishing or maintaining an alternate pedestrian route is not feasible during the project, an alternate means of providing for pedestrians may be used, such as adding free bus service around the project or assigning someone the responsibility to assist pedestrians with disabilities through the project limits. It must be recognized that pedestrians are reluctant to retrace their steps to a prior intersection for a crossing or to add distance or out-of-the-way travel to a destination. The following 3 items should be considered when planning for pedestrians in TTC zones. 1. Pedestrians should not be led into conflicts with vehicles, equipment, and operations. 2. Pedestrians should not be led into conflicts with vehicles moving through or around the worksite. 3. Pedestrians should be provided with a convenient and accessible path that replicates as nearly as practical the most desirable characteristics of the existing sidewalks or footpaths. A pedestrian route should not be severed or moved for non-construction activities, such as parking for vehicles and equipment. Consideration should be made to separate pedestrian movements from both worksite activity and vehicular traffic. Unless an acceptable route that does not involve crossing the roadway can be provided, pedestrians should be appropriately directed with advanced signing that encourages them to cross to the opposite side of the roadway. In urban and suburban areas with high vehicular traffic volumes, these signs should be placed at so that pedestrians are not confronted with mid-block worksites that will induce them to attempt skirting the worksite or making a mid-block crossing. These figures show typical TTC device usage and techniques for pedestrian movement through work zones. You can press the Documents button to view these images in more detail. To accommodate the needs of pedestrians, including those with disabilities, the following considerations should be addressed when temporary pedestrian pathways in TTC zones are designed or modified. A. Provisions for continuity of accessible paths for pedestrians should be incorporated into the TTC plan. B. Access to transit stops should be maintained. C. A smooth, continuous, hard surface should be provided through the entire length of the temporary pedestrian facility. There should be no curbs or abrupt changes in grade or terrain that could cause tripping or be a barrier to wheelchair use. The geometry and alignment of the facility should meet the applicable requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines for buildings and facilities. D. The width of the existing pedestrian facility should be provided for the temporary facility, if practical. Traffic control devices and other construction materials and features should not intrude into the usable width of the sidewalk, temporary pathway, or other pedestrian facility. When it is not possible to maintain a minimum width of 60 inches throughout the entire length of the pedestrian pathway, a 60 by 60 inch passing space should be provided at least every 200 feet to allow individuals in wheelchairs to pass. E. Blocked routes, alternate crossings, and sign and signal information should be communicated to pedestrians with visual disabilities by providing devices such as audible information devices, accessible pedestrian signals or barriers, and channelizing devices that are detectable to the pedestrians traveling with the aid of a long cane or who have low vision. Where pedestrian traffic is detoured to a TTC signal, engineering judgment should be used to determine if pedestrian signals or accessible pedestrian signals should be considered for crossings along an alternate route. F. When channelization is used to delineate a pedestrian pathway, a continuous detectable edging should be provided throughout the length of the facility such that pedestrians using a long cane can follow it. G. Signs and other devices mounted lower than 7 feet above the temporary pedestrian pathway should not project more than 4 inches into accessible pedestrian facilities. Whenever it is feasible, closing off the worksite from pedestrian intrusion may be preferable to channelizing pedestrian traffic along the site with TTC devices. Fencing should not create site distance restrictions for road users. Fences should not be constructed of materials that would be hazardous if impacted by vehicles. Wooden railing, fencing, and similar systems placed immediately adjacent to motor vehicle traffic should not be used as substitutes for crash-worthy temporary traffic barriers. Ballast for TTC devices should be kept to the minimum amount needed and should be mounted low to prevent penetration of the vehicle windshield. Movement by work vehicles and equipment across designated pedestrian paths should be minimized and, when necessary, should be controlled by flaggers or TTC. Staging or stopping of work vehicles or equipment along the side of pedestrian paths should be avoided, since it encourages movement of workers, equipment, and materials across the pedestrian path. Access to the workspace by workers and equipment across pedestrian walkways should be minimized because the access often creates unacceptable changes in grade and rough or muddy terrain, and pedestrians will tend to avoid these areas by attempting non-intersection crossings where no curb ramps are available. A canopied walkway may be used to protect pedestrians from falling debris and to provide a covered passage for pedestrians. Covered walkways should be sturdily constructed and adequately lighted for nighttime use. When pedestrian and vehicle paths are rerouted to a closer proximity to each other, consideration should be given to separating them by a temporary traffic barrier. If a temporary traffic barrier is used to shield pedestrians, it should be designed to accommodate site conditions. Depending on the possible vehicular speed and angle of impact, temporary traffic barriers might deflect upon impact by an errant vehicle. Guidance for locating and designing temporary traffic barriers can be found in Chapter 9 of AASHTO's Roadside Design Guide. Short, intermittent segments of temporary traffic barrier shall not be used because they nullify the containment and redirective capabilities of the temporary traffic barrier, increase the potential for serious injury both to vehicle occupants and pedestrians, and encourage the presence of blunt leading ends. All upstream leading ends that are present shall be appropriately flared or protected with properly installed and maintained crash-worthy cushions. Adjacent temporary traffic barrier segments shall be properly connected in order to provide the overall strength required for the temporary traffic barrier to perform properly. Normal vertical curbing shall not be used as a substitute for temporary traffic barriers when temporary traffic barriers are needed. Temporary traffic barriers or longitudinal channelizing devices may be used to discourage pedestrians from unauthorized movements into the workspace. They may also be used to inhibit conflicts with vehicular traffic by minimizing the possibility of midblock crossings. A major concern for pedestrians is urban and suburban building construction encroaching onto the contiguous sidewalks, which forces pedestrians off the curb into direct conflict with moving vehicles. If a significant potential exists for vehicle incursions into the pedestrian path, pedestrians should be rerouted or temporary traffic barriers should be installed. TTC devices, jersey barriers, and wood or chain link fencing with a continuous detectable edging can satisfactorily delineate a pedestrian path. Tape, rope, or plastic chain strung between devices are not detectable, do not comply with the design standards in the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility guidelines for buildings and facilities, and should not be used as a control for pedestrian movements. In general, pedestrian routes should be preserved in urban and commercial suburban areas. Alternative routing should be discouraged. The highway agency in charge of the TTC zone should regularly inspect the activity area so that effective pedestrian TTC is maintained.